The Atlanta sun beat down hard that afternoon, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin even in the shade. Inside Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the air hummed with the usual chaos. Rolling suitcases, hurried goodbyes, gate agents calling last-minute boarding passes over crackling speakers. Among the crowd was a teenager, maybe 17, wearing a faded gray hoodie, dark jeans, and well-worn sneakers. He carried a single backpack, no fancy luggage, no entourage. To most people rushing past, he looked like any other kid flying alone, maybe heading to summer camp, visiting family, or catching a connecting flight to college orientation. He moved quietly, eyes on his phone, shoulders slightly hunched like he was used to making himself small in big spaces. He didn't glance around nervously or fidget with his boarding pass. He just walked with calm purpose toward gate B12, where Delta Flight 1482 to Los Angeles was boarding. First class. That detail might have surprised anyone who saw him. First class wasn't where you'd expect to find someone dressed like he'd just rolled out of bed. But he wasn't there because of a lucky upgrade or a credit card perk. He was there because his father, though no one at the gate knew it, was one of the wealthiest men in the country. A self-made tech visionary who'd built an empire from a garage startup 2 decades earlier. And despite the billions, he'd raised his son to value humility over flash, to never assume respect was owed just because of a last name or a bank balance. The teen handed his boarding pass to the agent, who gave a polite nod and waved him through. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool cabin air a relief after the sticky terminal. The first-class cabin was nearly empty. He found his seat 2A window side and slid in without fuss. He tucked his backpack carefully into the overhead bin, took out a pair of noise-canceling headphones and settled in, already scrolling through messages from his younger sister back home. A few minutes later, the rest of first class began filing in. Business travelers in crisp suits, a couple celebrating an anniversary, an older woman with a small dog in a carrier. Then came the man. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing a tailored navy blazer and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He walked with the kind of confidence that comes from always getting what you want. Fast lanes, priority seating, the benefit of the doubt. When he reached row 2, he stopped, looked at the teen, and frowned. "You're in my seat," he said, voice sharp enough to cut through the cabin's soft hum. The teen looked up, calm. "I don't think so," he said gently. "I'm in 2A. The man didn't even glance at his own boarding pass. "No, son, that's mine. I booked this seat weeks ago." There was a pause, just long enough for the teen to feel the weight of the word son. Not friendly, not warm, but dismissive, like he was being corrected by someone who assumed he didn't belong. Still, the teen didn't argue. He pulled up his boarding pass on his phone and held it out. "See, 2A first class." The man barely looked at it. "Must be a glitch," he muttered, more to himself than to the boy. Then, without asking, without waiting for a flight attendant, he reached into the overhead bin, grabbed the teen's backpack, and yanked it down. It hit the floor with a thud. Before the teen could react, the man dropped into the window seat, adjusted his jacket, and turned to look out the window as if the matter were closed. A few nearby passengers exchanged glances. One woman opened her mouth like she might say something, then thought better of it. A flight attendant hovered near the galley but didn't intervene, just offered the man a glass of water with a tight smile. The teen stood there for a moment, backpack at his feet, hands in his pockets. He didn't raise his voice, didn't glare, didn't make a scene. He just took a slow breath, picked up his bag, and walked toward the back of the cabin. Not in anger, more like he needed space to think. He stepped into the small area near the rear lavatory, out of sight from most passengers. From his pocket, he pulled out his phone. No dramatics, no shaking hands. He dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice. "Hey," he said, voice low but steady. It happened again, a pause. Then, "Yeah, on Delta 1482, Atlanta to LA. Some guy just took my seat, threw my bag on the floor, acted like I didn't belong." Another pause. He listened, nodding slightly. "No, I'm okay, just, you know how it is." He didn't say more, didn't need to. The person on the other end understood. They always did. "Can you handle it?" he asked quietly. A few seconds passed. Then he said, "Thanks," and ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned against the wall for a moment, eyes closed. Not scared, not angry, just tired. Tired of having to prove he belonged in spaces his family had helped build. Tired of people seeing a black kid in a hoodie and assuming he was lost, mistaken, or worse. He walked back toward first class, not to confront the man, but because it was still his seat. He stood near the empty aisle seat across from 2A, arms crossed, waiting. The man in the window seat glanced over, scowled slightly, but said nothing. Then, just as the plane began to push back from the gate, two men in dark suits appeared at the jet bridge door. They weren't airline staff. They moved with quiet authority, showing badges to the gate agent before stepping aboard. Passengers turned to watch. The flight attendants stiffened. The two men walked straight to the cockpit, spoke briefly with the captain, then turned toward first class. One of them nodded at the teen, just a small, respectful acknowledgement, before approaching the man in 2A. "Sir," the taller one said, voice calm but firm, "we need you to come with us." The man blinked. "What? Why? I have a first-class ticket." "This isn't about your ticket," the other man said. "Please gather your things." Confused and now visibly nervous, the man stood clutching his briefcase. He shot a confused look at the teen, who met his eyes for just a second, no gloating, no smirk, before looking away. As the man was escorted off the plane, murmurs rippled through the cabin. People whispered. Some pulled out their phones. The teen sat down in 2A, the seat that had always been his, and finally put on his headphones. Outside, the plane was already being guided back to the gate. An announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen security protocol, we'll be returning to the terminal momentarily. We apologize for the inconvenience." No one knew the full story, not yet. But something had shifted, and though the teen just stared out the window, watching the tarmac blur past, he knew this wouldn't be the last time someone questioned where he belonged. But maybe, just maybe, it would be one of the last times they got away with it. Back at the gate, confusion swirled like a slow storm. Passengers spilled off the plane, some grumbling, others filming on their phones, all wondering what had just happened. The man in the navy blazer was already gone, whisked away by the two suited figures before most even realized he wasn't coming back. Flight attendants offered vague apologies and bottled water, but no real answers. "Security protocol," they kept saying, as if those words explained everything. Inside the terminal, the teen stayed calm. He didn't follow the crowd. Instead, he lingered near a quiet corner by a charging station, sipping a soda he'd bought from a kiosk. He scrolled through his messages again. His sister had sent a meme about flying first class like a normal person, and he smiled faintly. Normal. That word always made him pause. What was normal anyway? To him, normal was eating dinner with his dad every Sunday, no matter how busy they both were. Normal was tutoring kids at the community center near their old neighborhood. Normal was never letting wealth become a wall between him and the world. But to others, normal meant certain faces in certain places, faces that didn't look like his. Especially not in first class, especially not alone, especially not in a hoodie. About 20 minutes later, a woman in a sharp charcoal suit approached him. She wasn't one of the men from earlier, but she carried the same quiet confidence. She knelt slightly to meet his eyes, not out of pity, but respect. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Yeah, just tired of this." She didn't offer empty reassurance. Didn't say it'll get better or people just don't understand. She just placed a hand on his shoulder for a second and said, "Your dad's already on a call with Delta's CEO. They're grounding the flight until this is resolved properly." He sighed. "I didn't want it to blow up like this." "I know," she said. "But you didn't do anything wrong. You just existed in a space someone decided you shouldn't be in. That's on them, not you." Meanwhile, across town, in a sleek high-rise office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, his father sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, measured, but firm. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The CEO on the other end of the line was already sweating. "This isn't about a seat," the father said. "It's about the assumption that my son didn't belong there simply because of how he looked. Your staff saw what happened. They did nothing. That silence is complicity." He paused, then added, "I've been a loyal customer for 15 years. My company books hundreds of flights with you annually. But loyalty requires mutual respect. Right now I don't feel respected. And more importantly, my son doesn't. Back at the airport, news began to spread. Not through official channels, but through whispers, social media clips, and a single blurry photo someone had posted. A black teenager in a gray hoodie standing calmly while a well-dressed man argued over a seat. The caption read, "They tried to kick him out of first class. Then the plane got grounded." Within an hour, the post had thousands of shares. People were split. Some called it overreaction, others called it long overdue. Comment sections filled with stories of their own. Being followed in stores, questioned at hotels, asked to show ID for no reason. The teen's experience wasn't unique. It was just the latest example of something too many knew all too well. Delta's social media team scrambled. Their official accounts stayed silent, but internal emails flew between departments. Legal was involved. PR was drafting statements. Customer service reps were told to handle with extreme care any calls referencing Flight 1482. The teen, meanwhile, was offered a private lounge while they sorted things out. He declined. "I'll wait here," he said, gesturing to a quiet bench near a window. The woman in the charcoal suit stayed nearby, not hovering, just present, like a silent promise that he wouldn't be left alone again. A flight attendant from the original crew approached hesitantly. She looked nervous, eyes darting around before she spoke. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she whispered. "I saw what happened. I should have stepped in. I was scared I'd get in trouble for causing a scene." The teen looked at her, really looked. He saw regret, not malice. "It's okay," he said. "But next time, maybe speak up. Even quietly. That's all it takes sometimes." She nodded, tears welling, and walked away quickly. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower. Passengers from the original flight were rebooked on other airlines or offered hotel vouchers. Delta issued a terse statement. "We are investigating an incident involving passenger conduct and crew response on Flight 1482. Safety and dignity for all travelers remain our top priority." But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. The father hadn't just called the CEO. He'd also reached out to a few key journalists he trusted, not to sensationalize, but to ensure accountability. Not for revenge, but for change. He knew headlines faded. Policies lasted. By evening, Delta confirmed that the passenger who'd taken the seat had been banned from future flights. Not just for the seat dispute, but for verbal aggression and refusal to comply with crew instructions, once questioned on the ground. 3 crew members were placed on administrative leave pending review of their inaction, and quietly, without fanfare, the airline announced it would be revising its anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff within the next 30 days. The teen finally boarded a new flight, this time, a private jet arranged by his family's travel office. Not because he demanded it, but because after everything, his father wanted him to rest without another moment of stress. As the Gulfstream taxied down the runway, he looked out the window at the city lights below, thinking not about the man in the blazer, but about the flight attendant who apologized, the woman in the suit who stood by him, the strangers online who said, "This happened to me too." He wasn't angry. He was determined, because the real story wasn't about a billionaire's son getting his seat back. It was about what happens when people stop accepting that certain spaces aren't meant for certain people. It was about dignity, not dollars. And as the plane climbed into the night sky, he made a quiet promise to himself. He'd keep showing up, hoodie and all, wherever he belonged. And he'd make sure others could too. The private jet hummed softly as it cut through the night sky, its cabin lit by the soft glow of ambient lights and the occasional flicker from the city lights far below. Inside, the teen sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket the pilot had offered, sipping warm tea from a ceramic mug. It wasn't fancy, just chamomile, the kind his grandmother used to make when he couldn't sleep. Outside, the world felt distant, muffled, like the noise of the day had finally been left behind. But even in the quiet, his mind wouldn't settle. Not because he was upset, though the sting of being treated like an intruder in his own seat still lingered, but because he kept thinking about what came next. This wasn't just about him. He knew that. He'd seen the messages flooding in since the story started spreading. A college student in Chicago who'd been asked to prove she booked a business-class ticket. A grandfather in Houston turned away from a first-class lounge despite showing his pass. A young woman in Seattle told her designer bag, must be fake when she boarded a premium cabin. Their stories weren't viral. No one grounded a plane for them. But they'd lived it. And now, because of what happened in Atlanta, they felt seen. Back in Los Angeles, his father had already set things in motion. Not with lawsuits or public shaming, but with something quieter and more lasting. A partnership. By morning, his foundation would announce a new initiative with a national civil rights organization focused on bias in travel and hospitality. The goal wasn't to punish one airline. It was to change the culture across the entire industry. Training modules, anonymous reporting tools for staff who witness discrimination, third-party audits of customer service interactions. Real tools, not just slogans, but none of that was on the teen's mind as the jet began its descent into Van Nuys Airport. What he kept replaying was the look on the flight attendant's face when she apologized. Not fear, not guilt, just shame. The kind that comes when you realize you stayed silent when you should have spoken up. He hoped she'd find the courage next time. He hoped a lot of people would. When the wheels touched down, a black SUV waited on the tarmac. No flashing lights, no crowd, just a driver he'd known since he was 10, who gave him a small nod and said, "Rough day?" "Yeah," the teen replied, climbing in. But it could have been worse. The drive into the city was smooth, the streets quiet under a blanket of stars. He texted his sister, "Made it. No drama." She replied instantly with a gif of a dog wearing sunglasses and the words, "First-class energy." He smiled. That was her way of saying, "You handled it like a pro." At home, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. His dad was there, standing at the counter making grilled cheese, their go-to comfort food after a long day. No speeches, no lectures, just 2 slices of sourdough, sharp cheddar melting between them, and a glass of cold milk. They ate in silence for a while. Then his dad said, "You didn't have to call me, you know." "I know," the teen said, "but I was tired of pretending it doesn't happen." His dad nodded. "Good, don't ever pretend. The world needs people who name things for what they are." The next morning, the story was everywhere, but not in the way the teen expected. Most headlines didn't focus on his wealth. They focused on the moment. A young black man treated like he didn't belong. A crew that looked away. A system that only moved when someone with influence said enough. Some outlets even blurred his face in photos, respecting his privacy, which surprised him. He hadn't asked for that, but it felt human at school. Yes, he still went to a regular high school, not some elite private academy. He walked in like any other day. Hoodie, backpack, earbuds dangling. A few kids gave him knowing looks, but no one made a big deal. One friend clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Dude, my mom cried when she saw the news. Said it reminded her of her brother in the 90s. Another whispered, "My uncle works for an airline. He said your dad's new training program might actually change things." That was the part that mattered, not the viral moment, but the ripple. Later that week, he visited the community center where he volunteered. The kids there didn't care about first-class seats or private jets. They cared that he showed up every Tuesday to help with math homework and stayed late to shoot hoops. One 9-year-old, wide-eyed, tugged his sleeve and said, "Is it true you got a whole plane stopped because someone was mean to you?" He knelt down. "Not because they were mean," he said gently, "because they thought I didn't belong, and I wanted them and everyone watching to know that we all belong. No matter what we wear or what we look like." The kid nodded like that made perfect sense. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Delta wasn't the only airline paying attention. Within days, 2 other major carriers quietly announced they were reviewing their own customer service protocols. A flight attendant union issued a statement supporting mandatory anti-bias refresher courses. Even the Transportation Security Administration said it would explore ways to reduce subjective profiling at checkpoints. None of it happened overnight. None of it erased decades of ingrained assumptions, but something had shifted just a little, like a crack in a thick wall letting light through. The teen didn't give interviews. He didn't post about it on social media. He just went back to his life, school, volunteering, late-night calls with his sister, Sunday dinners with his dad. But he started paying closer attention, not just to how he was treated, but to how others were treated around him. At the grocery store, he noticed the cashier double-checking a Latina woman's card, but not his. At the movie theater, he saw security follow a group of black teens while ignoring rowdy white kids. Small things, quiet injustices, the kind most people scroll past. Now he didn't look away. One afternoon, while waiting for his coffee at a local shop, he saw a barista snap at an older Asian man for mumbling his order. Without thinking, the teen stepped in. "Hey, he just asked for a large black coffee." "Happens to everyone." The barista flushed, apologized. The man gave the teen a grateful nod. It wasn't a grand gesture. No planes were grounded. No CEOs called. But it was something. Because the real work wasn't in the headlines. It was in the everyday moments, choosing to speak up, to see people, to refuse to accept that some folks just don't fit in certain spaces. The teen knew his privilege had given him a louder voice that day in Atlanta. But he also knew that voice meant nothing if he didn't use it for more than just himself. As he walked home that evening, hoodie pulled up against the cool breeze. He passed a bus stop where a young girl sat alone, clutching a worn backpack, staring at the sky like she was waiting for something or someone to change her day. He didn't know her story, but he slowed his steps, made sure she saw him nod in greeting, just to say, "You're seen. You belong here too." And sometimes that was enough. A few weeks after the flight, life had settled into a new kind of normal. The headlines had faded. The social media storm had calmed. Most people had moved on to the next big story. But for the teen, things felt different, not because of the attention, but because of the quiet conversations that kept happening in places no camera could reach. At school, a teacher pulled him aside after class one day. She wasn't his usual teacher, just someone who'd seen him around and finally worked up the nerve to say something. "I've been teaching for 20 years, she said, voice low, "and I never realized how often I called on certain students over others until I saw what happened with you. It made me look at my own classroom differently." She didn't ask for praise. She just wanted him to know she was trying. That meant more to him than any viral post ever could. Meanwhile, the ripple from Atlanta kept spreading in ways no one predicted. A small regional airline in the Midwest reached out to his father's foundation, not for money, but for help designing a training program that actually worked, something built with input from flight crews, not just corporate HR. They wanted real change, not just a checkbox. Even more surprising was the letter that arrived one afternoon, hand-delivered to their home. No return address, just a plain envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly written in blue ink. "I was the gate agent on Flight 1482. I saw what happened. I didn't say anything because I was afraid I'd lose my job if I caused trouble. But watching you stay calm while being treated like you didn't belong, it stayed with me. I've signed up for the new bias training. I've also started speaking up when I see things that feel wrong, even if it's just a look, a tone, a pause too long. Thank you for showing me that dignity doesn't need an announcement. It just needs to be defended." The teen read it twice, then tucked it into his journal. He didn't show it to anyone. Some things were too personal to share. Back in the air, things were changing too. Flight attendants across the country began reporting subtle shifts. Passengers were more aware. Crews were more alert. One veteran attendant shared in an internal forum how she'd recently stepped in when a fellow passenger questioned a young Muslim woman's boarding pass, something she admitted she might have ignored before. "After Atlanta," she wrote, "I realized silence isn't neutrality. It's permission." The teen didn't know about that post, but he felt the difference the next time he flew. This time coach on purpose just to visit his cousins in Detroit. He wore the same gray hoodie, same backpack, but this time when he boarded, the flight attendant greeted him by name. His boarding pass had his first name, nothing more, and said, "Welcome aboard." Window or aisle? No double checking. No hesitation. Just respect. It wasn't perfect. He knew that. But it was progress. At home, his dad started involving him more in the foundation's work, not as a figurehead, but as a real voice. They sat together late one night, reviewing proposals for a youth-led travel equity council, a group of teens from different backgrounds who'd advise airlines on how to make flying feel safer and fairer for everyone. The teens suggested they include kids who'd never flown before, those who only knew airports from TV or stories. "If we're talking about belonging," he said, "we can't just listen to people who already have a seat at the table." His dad smiled. "You're getting good at this." "I'm just tired of pretending the table's full when there's still room," he replied. One Saturday, he visited the airport, not to fly, but to observe. He sat near a busy gate with a notebook, watching how people moved, how staff interacted, who got questioned, and who got waved through. He wasn't spying. He was learning. And what he noticed surprised him. It wasn't always about race. Sometimes it was age, a teenager with dyed hair getting extra scrutiny. Sometimes it was language, a family speaking Spanish asked to repeat their destination 3 times. Sometimes it was just exhaustion, fear, or a bad day turning into unfair treatment. Bias wasn't always loud. Often it was quiet, a glance, a pause, a tone. And that made it harder to fight because it lived in the spaces between words. But he also saw kindness. A gate agent helping an elderly man with his walker, a passenger giving up their overhead space for a mom with a stroller, a TSA officer kneeling to talk to a scared child at eye level. Those moments didn't make news, but they mattered just as much. That evening he posted something rare, a short note on his private social account, visible only to close friends and family. People keep asking if I'm angry. I'm not. I'm awake. And being awake means you don't just notice the broken things. You look for the people trying to fix them. They're everywhere. You just have to pay attention. A few days later, he got an unexpected call, not from his dad's office, but from a high school in Atlanta. A teacher there had started a student-led belonging project, inspired by what happened on Flight 1482. They wanted him to speak, not as a billionaire's son, but as a kid who stood his ground. He agreed, but only if it was a conversation, not a speech. I don't want them to see me as special, he told his dad. I want them to see themselves as capable. The visit was low-key. No press, no fanfare. Just him sitting in a classroom with 20 students answering questions like, what do you do when no one believes you? And how do you stay calm when you're being treated unfairly? He didn't give perfect answers. He said sometimes he cried in the bathroom. Sometimes he replayed the moment over and over, wondering if he should have said something different. But mostly, he said, he leaned on the people who loved him and reminded himself that his worth wasn't up for debate. Afterward, a quiet girl with braids and paint-stained fingers handed him a small drawing. It showed a plane in the sky and inside a single seat glowing with light. On the back she'd written, "You made the light visible." He kept that drawing on his desk because in the end this wasn't about grounding a flight. It was about lifting others up. And as long as he kept showing up, hoodie, honesty, and all, he knew the journey was just beginning. Months had passed since that afternoon in Atlanta, and the world had moved on, as it always does. New headlines, new dramas, new moments demanding attention. But for the teen, the quiet after the storm was where the real work lived. Not in the glare of cameras or the buzz of trending topics, but in the small, steady choices people made when no one was watching. He was back at school, back in the rhythm of homework, basketball practice, and late-night study sessions. He still wore the gray hoodie, though it was starting to fray at the cuffs, and still carried the same backpack, now patched with a small embroidered star his little sister had sewn on as a joke. "So you never lose your seat again," she'd said, grinning. But something had shifted inside him. He didn't see himself as a symbol or a story. He saw himself as a witness and a participant, because what happened on that flight wasn't an ending. It was a doorway. One crisp morning, he walked into the community center earlier than usual. The place was quiet, just a few staff setting up for the day. He went straight to the bulletin board and pinned up a flyer he'd helped design. Travel with respect. Youth listening circle. Share your story. Shape the future. It wasn't flashy, just simple words, a date, and a promise. Your voice matters, even if no one's been listening. By the time the event rolled around, the room was full, not just with teens, but with parents, teachers, even a couple of off-duty flight attendants who'd heard about it through word of mouth. No speeches, no panels, just chairs in a circle, cups of hot chocolate, and space to talk. A girl spoke first. She'd been stopped 3 times at the same airport security line, always asked to step aside while her white friends walked through. A boy shared how he'd been told his family's vacation photos didn't look real when he showed them in class. Another teen, soft-spoken and nervous, admitted he'd stopped flying altogether after being humiliated on a trip with his grandparents. The teen listened. Really listened. Not to fix, not to respond, but to hold space. And when it was his turn, he didn't talk about first class or private jets. He talked about the moment he realized his backpack on the floor wasn't just about a seat. It was about being told, without words, that he was out of place. Afterward, one of the flight attendants approached him. "We're starting a crew-led initiative," she said. "We call it See Me, Not My Stereotype. We're training each other to notice our own blind spots and to back each other up when someone steps out of line, passenger or crew." She handed him a small pin, a silver airplane with a heart in the center. "Wear it if you want. Or don't, but know people are trying." He pinned it to the inside of his backpack, where only he would see it. Back home, his dad had quietly stepped back, letting him lead more of the Foundation's youth outreach. They'd launched a pilot program with 3 major airlines, placing anonymous feedback kiosks near gates where travelers could report uncomfortable interactions, without fear of retaliation. The data wasn't public, but early results showed a pattern. Most complaints weren't about overt racism, but about tone, assumption, and invisibility. People didn't want grand apologies. They just wanted to be seen as they were. One evening, while scrolling through news clips for a school project, the teen stumbled on a short documentary a film student had made about invisible travelers, people who fly often but are rarely acknowledged in ads, safety videos, or airline marketing. There was the elderly woman who flew monthly to visit her grandchildren, the non-binary teen heading to college, the immigrant father reuniting with family after years apart. Their stories were ordinary, powerful, and full of quiet dignity. He sent the link to his dad with one word: "This." His dad replied instantly, "Let's fund the next one." It wasn't about money. It was about making room. As graduation neared, colleges came calling, not just with scholarships, but with invitations to help shape their inclusion programs. He turned down the flashy offers. Instead, he chose a school known for its community engagement, where he planned to study public policy and keep volunteering at local shelters and transit hubs. "I don't want to just talk about change," he told his sister. "I want to live where it's happening." She rolled her eyes. "You're such a nerd." "Yeah," he said, smiling. "But I'm your nerd." The real turning point came not in a boardroom or on a stage, but in an airport bathroom. He was waiting in line when a young boy, maybe 10, clutching his mom's hand, looked up at him and whispered, "Are you the kid from the plane?" The teen crouched down. "Yeah, that was me." The boy's eyes widened. "Did they say sorry?" "Some did," he said gently. "And some are still learning." The mom gave him a grateful nod. "He's been scared to fly since we got pulled aside last year. Seeing you, it helped." In that moment, he realized the story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been made to feel small in a big space, and chose to stand tall anyway. On the 1-year anniversary of Flight 1482, no press release went out. No anniversary post, just a quiet dinner at home. The same grilled cheese, the same kitchen light. His dad raised his glass of milk. "To staying awake," he said. "To staying kind," the teen replied. Because that was the lesson he'd carried forward. Standing up for yourself didn't mean tearing others down. It meant creating space where everyone could breathe, belong, and simply be. Now when he flies, he still sits in first class sometimes, when his dad insists or when work demands it. But more often he chooses coach. Not to prove a point, but because that's where the world lives, in the messy, beautiful, ordinary middle. And he likes being part of it. He still gets looks, still gets questions, but now he meets them with calm eyes and open hands. Not because he's fearless, but because he knows he's not alone. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change begins. Not with a grounded plane, but with 1,000 small acts of courage, kindness, and quiet insistence that everyone, everywhere deserves a seat. It had been over a year since that flight in Atlanta, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The teen was no longer just a kid who'd been disrespected on a plane. He'd become someone people quietly looked to when things felt unfair. Not because he shouted the loudest, but because he listened the deepest. He still wore hoodies, still carried that patched backpack, still showed up to school like any other student. But something inside him had shifted, like a compass needle finally finding true north. He was in his first semester of college now, living in a small dorm room with posters of old jazz musicians and a shelf full of dog-eared books on civil rights, urban planning, and psychology. He hadn't chosen a flashy school or a high-profile major. Instead, He'd picked a university known for its community partnerships where students spent as much time off campus as on it. Tutoring, organizing, listening. That's what he cared about now, not just fixing broken systems, but building new ones from the ground up, with people at the center. One rainy Thursday afternoon, he sat in a folding chair at a neighborhood town hall held in a repurposed church basement. The topic was public transit, specifically how to make buses and trains feel safer and more welcoming for teens, seniors, and people with disabilities. He wasn't there as a speaker. He was there as a note-taker, part of a student team working with the city's transportation department. As an older woman described being ignored by a bus driver who assumed she didn't know where she was going, he wrote down every word, not just the facts but the feeling behind them, the embarrassment, the frustration, the quiet erosion of dignity. After the meeting, a city planner pulled him aside. "You've got a gift," she said. "You don't just hear what people say. You hear what they're afraid to say." He shrugged. "I've been on the other side of that silence. I know how it feels." That night, back in his dorm, he opened his laptop and started drafting a proposal, not for a grant or a headline, but for a pilot program he'd been thinking about for months. He called it Travel with Dignity. The idea was simple. Train frontline transit workers not just in rules but in empathy. Bring in riders to share their real experiences. Create a feedback loop that wasn't punitive but supportive. And most importantly, pay the community members who shared their stories because their time and truth had value. He sent the draft to his dad, not for approval, but for feedback. His dad replied within minutes. "This is good. Really good. Let's fund the first phase ourselves. No strings, no branding. Just see what grows." That was the thing about his family's wealth now. It wasn't a shield. It was a seed. A few weeks later, the first Travel with Dignity workshop took place in a community center near the city's main bus terminal. 20 bus drivers, 10 customer service reps, and 15 local riders, some elderly, some teens, some non-English speakers, sat in a circle. No podiums, no PowerPoints, just conversation. One driver admitted he'd once assumed a young black man with headphones was up to no good, only to later see him helping an elderly passenger off the bus. A teen shared how she stopped taking the train after a security guard followed her for 3 stops, just in case. The room didn't erupt in anger. It filled with understanding. Afterward, one of the drivers approached the teen. "I've driven this route for 12 years, he said, voice rough. "Never thought about how it feels to be on the other side of my glare. Thank you for making me see." The teen just nodded. "Thank you for being willing to look." Word of the workshop spread, not through press releases but through word of mouth. Drivers telling other drivers, riders telling neighbors. Within 2 months, 3 more cities reached out, asking how they could start something similar. The teen and his student team created a simple toolkit, discussion guides, reflection prompts, evaluation forms, and made it free to download. No copyright, no fine print, just pass it on. Back on campus, he kept his head down, focused on classes and his part-time job at the campus food pantry. He didn't want to be known as the plain kid anymore. He wanted to be known as someone who showed up, stayed humble, and did the work, even when no one was watching. But the world wasn't quite ready to let go of the story. One morning, he got a call from a documentary filmmaker, not a big studio, just an independent creator who'd followed the ripple effects of that Atlanta flight for over a year. She'd interviewed flight attendants, gate agents, passengers, even the man who'd taken the seat, who, to his credit, had written a letter of apology months later, though it never got sent. Now she wanted to include the teen's perspective, not as a hero, but as a human being navigating the aftermath. He hesitated. He didn't want to reopen old wounds or make it about him, but then he thought about all the kids who'd messaged him saying, "I saw myself in you." Maybe his voice could help them feel less alone, he agreed, but only if the film centered the community efforts, not his family's wealth. "Tell the story of the change," he said, "not the drama." The interview happened on a quiet Sunday in the campus garden. No lights, no crew, just her, a small camera, and a bench under an oak tree. She asked him one question. "What do you hope people take away from all this?" He thought for a long time. Then he said, "That belonging isn't something you earn. It's something you're born with. And no one, no airline, no store, no stranger on a bus gets to take that away from you. But it's also our job to protect it for each other. The film premiered at a small festival months later. It didn't win awards. It didn't go viral. But it played in community centers, schools, and transit offices across the country. And in one screening in Atlanta, a flight attendant from Delta's original crew sat in the back, tears in her eyes, texting her team, "We can do better. We are doing better." Meanwhile, the teen kept moving forward. He joined a student coalition pushing for more inclusive design in public spaces, benches wide enough for wheelchairs, signage in multiple languages, lighting that made people feel safe, not surveilled. He started mentoring high schoolers through a program that paired them with college students who'd face similar challenges. One of his mentees, a quiet girl from a rural town, told him, "I used to think I had to change everything about myself to fit in. Now I think maybe the world just needs to make more room." He smiled. Exactly. As the school year wound down, he got an unexpected invitation, not from a corporation or a news outlet, but from a group of retired transportation workers. They'd formed an advocacy network and wanted him to speak at their annual gathering. Not as a speaker, but as a partner. "We've spent our lives moving people," their letter read. "Now we want to help move justice," he went. And instead of giving a speech, he facilitated a conversation. For 2 hours, retirees shared stories from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, times when bias was even more baked into the system, but also times when small acts of courage made a difference. A bus driver who let a homeless teen ride for free during a snowstorm. A ticket agent who quietly upgraded a single mom's seat so her kids could sleep. These weren't grand gestures. They were human ones. Driving back to campus that night, he rolled down the window and let the cool air fill the car. He thought about how far things had come, not because one plane was grounded, but because people chose again and again to do better. He wasn't naive. He knew racism, classism, and bias hadn't vanished, but he also knew they weren't unchangeable. Change happened in the space between a glance and a greeting, between silence and a question, between assumption and curiosity. Now, when he traveled, whether by bus, train, or plane, he carried that truth with him. Not as a burden, but as a compass. And as he pulled into his dorm parking lot, hoodie damp from the evening drizzle, he felt something quiet settle in his chest. Not pride, not victory, but peace. Because the work wasn't done, but he wasn't alone. And as long as people kept showing up, with open eyes, open hearts, and the courage to say this isn't right, there would always be room for everyone.